It was one of those dry, dusty afternoons that seemed to melt into every other in Jack's small town. He stood outside the auto repair shop, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. His boss, Greg, had just stormed out again, barking orders about how time was money, and charity doesn't pay bills. Jack was used to it. He'd been working there for 5 years, mostly in silence, fixing other people's cars while keeping his head down. He wasn't the loud type. Just a guy who believed a good job spoke louder than any words. That day, an old, beat-up sedan rolled slowly into the lot. The kind that coughed smoke with every breath. Behind the wheel was an elderly woman, wearing a sun-faded hat and a kind but tired smile. She looked lost, both in the literal and emotional sense. Jack noticed immediately that she wasn't from around there. Her license plate was from out of state. When she stepped out, he could see she was trembling slightly, clutching her handbag like it was her only shield in the world. "Ma'am, everything okay?" Jack asked, his tone gentle. "My car just stopped," she said softly. "I was driving to visit my daughter. Haven't seen her in years. It started smoking near the gas station, and they told me to come here." Jack nodded, already popping the hood. The smell of burnt oil hit him instantly. He ran his hands over the engine, eyes narrowing. A blown gasket. The kind of issue that would take hours and cost more than the old car was probably worth. He looked up at her. She was watching him nervously, clutching her purse tighter. Greg walked out just then, lighting a cigarette. "What's this?" he barked. Jack explained, keeping his voice steady. Greg didn't like long explanations. "She can't afford that," Greg said flatly, scanning the old woman like she was wasting space. "Tell her to tow it somewhere else. We don't do charity." Jack looked at the woman again. Her eyes dropped, shame clouding her face. It struck him then, how easily people are made to feel small. Without thinking, he said, "I'll fix it." Greg snapped his head around. "You'll what?" "I'll fix it," Jack repeated. "You can dock it from my pay." Greg stared at him for a long second, then smirked. "Your funeral," he muttered before walking back inside. Jack worked until his arms ached. The woman sat quietly on a bench outside, watching. Every now and then she'd offer him water or ask if he wanted a sandwich. He just smiled and shook his head. The hours passed, the sun dipped, and the world grew quiet except for the sound of metal and grit. Finally, he tightened the last bolt and wiped the sweat off his forehead. When the engine started, smoothly, quietly, the old lady's face lit up. She looked like she might cry. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, voice trembling. "Nothing," Jack said, wiping his hands. "It's on me." She blinked. "I can't let you do that." "Then pay it forward," he said simply. "Help someone else who needs it." For a long moment, she just stood there, watching him. Then she nodded, slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "You remind me of my son," she whispered. "He used to fix cars too. He passed away a few years ago." Jack didn't know what to say. He just gave a small nod and offered a tired smile. When she drove off, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees, painting the sky with the last shades of orange. Jack didn't know why, but he felt lighter. Like he'd done something that still mattered in a world that often forgot what kindness looked like. He cleaned up, locked the shop, and went home. His apartment was small. Bare walls, a single couch, and a fridge that hummed louder than it should. He heated up leftover pasta, sat on the couch, and replayed the day in his head. There was a peace in helping someone, without expecting anything back. He didn't know that peace would soon cost him more than he could imagine. The next morning, Greg was waiting at the shop, red-faced, holding a clipboard. "You think this is a charity?" he yelled the second Jack walked in. "You think you can just fix cars for free like you own the place?" Jack froze. "It came out of my hours." "Don't talk back," Greg cut him off. "You made me look like a fool. That old hag came back last night asking about you. You had no right to touch her car without permission. She was stranded." "Greg," Jack said, his voice rising for the first time. "You would have left her out there. I would have done what's good for business." Greg roared. "And you're fired. Pack your tools and get out." The words hit harder than Jack expected. He'd spent 5 years there, 5 years showing up early, staying late, doing every job without complaint. And just like that, he was out. 3 days passed before Jack finally accepted that his job was gone. He'd spent most of that time sitting on his porch with a cup of stale coffee, staring at the same cracked road he'd driven for years. Bills were already stacking up. Rent was due in a week. He'd applied to 2 nearby garages, but one had too many workers, and the other wanted someone younger. That line stung more than he'd admit. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret what he'd done. Somewhere inside, he believed that small acts of kindness still meant something, even if the world didn't reward them. On the 4th morning, a white envelope arrived in his mailbox. No return address, just his name written in careful, shaky handwriting. He tore it open and found a note inside. It read, "Thank you for your kindness. Sometimes what looks like a small gesture changes more than you know. M." Folded with it was a check. Jack stared at the numbers for a long moment, thinking it was a mistake. $10,000. His breath caught. He flipped the paper over twice, expecting a catch or a scam. There was nothing. No number to call, no reason given. His first instinct was to return it, but there was no address, no trace. He felt the old woman's voice echo in his head, the quiet, trembling tone when she'd said, "You remind me of my son." He wondered if this was her way of saying thank you, though he couldn't imagine how she'd have that kind of money. He set the check on the counter, staring at it like it might explain itself. He could have cashed it right away, but something in him hesitated. Instead, he called his bank, explained what happened, and they confirmed the check was legitimate, from a corporate account. That puzzled him even more. He'd expected her to live on a pension, not have access to something like that. Later that day, he decided to use a small portion to catch up on rent and fix his truck's busted transmission. The rest, he tucked away. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope. He even stopped by a local diner to hand in his resume. Nothing fancy, just a mechanic's helper job, part-time, but enough to start rebuilding. By the weekend, he had a call back from the diner's owner's brother, who ran a small service station a few towns over. The man had heard about what Jack did. Apparently word spread fast in small towns. He said, "Anyone who helps a stranger like that without expecting anything back, that's the kind of man I want in my shop." Jack couldn't believe it. He started the next morning, grateful for the chance to turn the page. The shop was smaller but honest. The pay wasn't much, yet the atmosphere was different. The owner treated his workers with respect, something Jack hadn't felt in a long time. Within a few weeks, he'd become the go-to guy for tough repairs, the one customers asked for by name. He never bragged about it. He just worked quietly, the same way he always had. One day, as he was finishing a brake job, a sleek black car pulled into the lot. A man in a suit stepped out and asked for him by name. Jack wiped his hands on his rag, puzzled. The man handed him a business card with a company logo embossed in gold. "My employer would like to speak with you," he said. "She insists." Jack almost laughed. He wasn't the kind of man who got summoned anywhere. But curiosity got the better of him, and he agreed to follow the car into town. They stopped at a large office building he'd never noticed before. Inside, everything gleamed: glass walls, polished floors, the faint hum of quiet power. He felt out of place in his oil-stained boots. The man led him into a top-floor office. At the window stood a woman, hair silver like the edges of dawn. When she turned, Jack froze. It was her, the old lady, only now she wasn't in faded clothes or an old hat. She was elegant, confident, her eyes bright with recognition. "Mr. Carson," she said warmly. "I'm glad you came." Jack blinked, unsure what to say. "Ma'am, I didn't realize that I wasn't just an old lady with a broken car," she finished, smiling. "That's usually how people see me." She gestured for him to sit. He hesitated, then obeyed. "My name is Margaret Reynolds," she continued. "I own Reynolds Automotive. We design and manufacture engine systems for several major companies." Jack just stared, stunned. The name sounded familiar. He'd seen it stamped on engine parts for years. "I was traveling incognito that day," she said. "It's something I do often. I like to see how people treat those who can't give anything in return. Most ignore, some judge, and a few, show kindness. Jack finally found his voice. I didn't do it for any reason, ma'am. You needed help. She smiled softly. That's exactly why you're here. He frowned, confused. I looked into you after that day, she explained. You lost your job because you helped me. That didn't sit right with me. I could have written you a check and walked away, but I wanted to see what kind of man you really were. You didn't cash it right away. You didn't brag about what you did. That told me everything I needed to know. Jack felt his throat tighten. I just did what anyone should have done. Not everyone would have, she said. Which is why I want to offer you something. I'm opening a new division, testing and repairing engines. I need someone who understands machines but, more importantly, understands people. I want you to lead it. Jack's jaw tightened. Lead it, ma'am, I'm just a mechanic. She shook her head gently. No, you're the kind of mechanic who sees people behind the cars. That's rare. The pay is 6 times what you made before. Benefits included. If you say yes, you start Monday. He sat in silence, staring at his calloused hands. For the first time, he felt seen. All the years of quiet labor, of being overlooked, suddenly made sense. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Why me? Margaret leaned back, eyes kind but firm. Because you reminded me of my son. He built this company with me before he passed. You have the same spirit. I think he would have liked you. Jack swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him. He nodded slowly. As he left that building, sunlight hit his face, and he realized life had come full circle in the strangest way. The woman he'd helped without expecting a thing had just changed his world. He smiled to himself, thinking how fate sometimes hides behind the most ordinary moments, like fixing a broken car for someone who turns out to hold the keys to your future. Jack barely slept that night. Every thought circled back to the offer, the meeting, and the look in Margaret's eyes when she said he reminded her of her son. He sat at his small kitchen table, the same one that had been covered with overdue bills just days before, now holding a neatly folded contract. The logo at the top, Reynolds Automotive, seemed unreal, like something pulled out of someone else's life. He kept rereading the words, division lead, unsure how they could possibly apply to him. For years, he'd been just another pair of hands in a noisy garage, fixing what others broke and rarely being thanked for it. And suddenly, this woman saw value in him that he'd never seen in himself. By morning, his decision was made. He signed the contract and showed up to work at the new facility. It wasn't like any garage he'd ever stepped into. Clean, quiet, filled with machines so advanced they looked like they belonged in a laboratory. Engineers walked by with tablets instead of toolboxes. He felt out of place at first, like a stranger in a world built for people with degrees and suits. But when they brought him an engine to assess, a prototype that had been giving them trouble for months, his instincts took over. Within an hour, he'd pinpointed the problem. By the end of the day, it was running smoother than it ever had. The team stared at him like he'd performed magic. Word spread fast within the company. The new guy, they called him, the hands that can hear machines breathe. Even Margaret stopped by that afternoon, watching quietly as he worked. She didn't say much, just smiled, the kind of smile that said she'd made the right choice. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt proud of himself, not for a paycheck, not for approval, but because he'd finally found where he belonged. Weeks turned into months. Jack's division grew rapidly. He handpicked a small team, people who reminded him of himself, honest, hardworking, often overlooked. He taught them not just to fix machines, but to respect them. Every car tells a story, he'd say. Listen first, then fix. It became the motto of the department, something Margaret loved so much she had it printed on the workshop wall. But success came with its share of shadows. Not everyone in the company was thrilled about an ex-mechanic leading one of the most efficient teams in the building. A few executives whispered behind closed doors, questioning Margaret's decision. They saw Jack as an outsider, someone who hadn't earned his place through the proper channels. One of them, a man named Collins, made it a point to undermine Jack at every chance. "You got lucky," Collins once told him in passing, voice dripping with condescension. Jack just nodded, choosing silence over confrontation. He'd learned long ago that real work spoke louder than arguments. Margaret, however, noticed everything. She admired Jack's restraint, but she also knew how ruthless corporate politics could be. She called him into her office one afternoon and said, "Don't let people like Collins shake your faith. You're here because of who you are, not who they think you should be." Jack only nodded, though the words stuck with him. As winter rolled in, the company faced a major crisis. A major client's new line of engines had a critical failure, and deadlines were collapsing. The engineers were in chaos, unable to find the fault. Margaret gathered her top team, including Jack, and laid it out plainly. If they didn't fix it within 2 weeks, the company would lose millions and likely face public embarrassment. Jack volunteered to lead the diagnostic team. Some doubted him, others mocked the idea of the mechanics saving the engineers, but he didn't care. He stayed in the lab day and night, running tests, tearing apart engines, and reassembling them until his hands ached. One evening, while the others had gone home, he noticed something subtle, a vibration pattern in the valves that didn't match the specs. It was small, barely noticeable, but it reminded him of a similar issue he'd fixed years ago in a customer's pickup truck. He made a few adjustments, recorded the results, and the numbers aligned perfectly. The fault wasn't in the design, it was in the calibration process. He documented everything and presented it the next morning. The board was stunned. Collins, who had been betting on his failure, had nothing to say. Margaret's eyes gleamed with pride. The fix saved the company not only millions but also its reputation. Overnight, Jack became more than just a hired hand, he became a symbol of integrity and skill. Reporters wanted to interview him, but he politely declined, saying, "The story's not about me. It's about doing what's right, even when no one's looking." Margaret invited him to dinner a few days later at her home, a modest place despite her wealth. They sat by the fireplace as she told him about her son, Daniel. He'd been just like Jack, humble, gifted with machines, always putting people first. He'd died young in an accident, years before Jack ever met her. "When I saw you that day, fixing my car," she said softly, "it felt like I'd been given a second chance to see the kind of man he would have become." Jack didn't know how to respond. He just sat quietly, humbled, understanding for the first time that what had happened wasn't just luck, it was purpose meeting opportunity. Margaret looked at him and smiled. "Promise me one thing," she said. "No matter how high you climb, never forget why you started." He nodded. "I won't." Over the next few months, Margaret's health began to decline. She still came to the office occasionally, always checking in on the division she'd trusted him with. Jack noticed her energy fading but never mentioned it. One morning, he received a call from her assistant asking him to come to her house. When he arrived, she was sitting by the window, pale but peaceful. She handed him an envelope. "Whatever happens next," she said, "I know this company will be in good hands." Inside the envelope was a letter and a document transferring partial ownership of the new division to him. She'd made it official. Jack wasn't just an employee anymore. He was a partner. He tried to protest, but she waved her hand gently. "It's not a gift," she said. "It's recognition." That night, as he drove home, he thought about how strange life could be. One small act of kindness, fixing an old lady's car for free, had led him to this. He hadn't sought reward or fame, yet he'd found both in the most unexpected way. The same hands that had once been greasy and calloused now held responsibility for hundreds of workers and millions in contracts, but his heart was still the same. He still believed in doing good quietly, without fanfare. Months passed, and the company flourished under Jack's leadership. The small division that had started as an experiment became the heart of Reynolds Automotive's innovation. His team expanded from a handful of mechanics to dozens of skilled technicians and engineers who worked together like a family. They trusted him because he never pretended to be above them. He still showed up in the same worn boots, rolled up his sleeves, and got his hands dirty alongside everyone else. He didn't sit behind glass walls. He worked where the sound of tools echoed and where real progress was made. The company culture began to shift around him, less about profit, more about purpose. When Margaret passed away quietly in her sleep, the entire company felt it like a heartbeat stopping. Jack attended the funeral surrounded by hundreds of employees, all united by the legacy of the woman who had believed in kindness as much as in innovation. The will was read a week later. Margaret had left behind a detailed succession plan. To everyone's surprise, she'd named Jack not just as the head of her division, but as acting CEO until the board could vote on a permanent replacement. The decision caused a stir. Some executives questioned it, others supported it openly. Jack didn't want the position. He never craved power, but he also knew walking away would dishonor the woman who had trusted him. So he accepted, humbly, promising himself that the values she lived by would guide every choice he made. The first months were hard. The corporate side of things was foreign to him: meetings, shareholders, strategy sessions. He made mistakes, but he learned fast. He refused to let greed or pride steer his decisions. Instead, he introduced policies that prioritized ethical repair practices, fair wages, and training for young mechanics from underprivileged backgrounds. A good company doesn't just build engines, he told his board, it builds people. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a shift in identity. Within a year, Reynolds Automotive was not only thriving financially but earning public respect for its integrity. Despite his new position, Jack stayed the same. He drove his old pickup, the same one he'd used when fixing Margaret's car. He lived in the same small apartment for a long time, though he could have afforded anything. His coworkers often joked that he was the only CEO whose hands still smelled faintly of oil. For Jack, that smell was a reminder of where it all began, a symbol of honesty and humility that no promotion could erase. One afternoon, during an industry conference, Jack was asked to give a speech about leadership. He hated public speaking but agreed because Margaret would have wanted him to. Standing before a hall of executives and young engineers, he said simply, "I don't know much about business theory. I only know that when you see someone stranded, you stop to help. That day I didn't fix a car, I fixed my perspective. You don't know who people are or what they carry with them. Sometimes the smallest act changes a life. Sometimes it changes two." The room fell silent, and for a moment, the noise of titles and profits faded into something real. His story spread far beyond the company. It reached trade magazines, social media, even small-town newspapers. Everyone called it the mechanic's lesson, and people began to see him as the symbol of how decency could still survive in a corporate world. Yet Jack never liked the attention. Whenever journalists asked how it felt to go from being fired to running the company, he'd shrug and say, "I just fixed a car. The rest wasn't up to me." A few years later, he founded the Reynolds Foundation in Margaret's honor. Its mission was to fund scholarships for young technicians, especially those who couldn't afford school. Every year, he personally interviewed the candidates, asking them not about grades but about their character. He wanted to know what kind of people they were when no one was watching. Many of those students went on to become some of the best engineers in the industry, carrying forward the same principles he had lived by: humility, hard work, and compassion. In private, Jack often visited Margaret's grave. He'd bring a single white rose and talk to her quietly, as if updating her on the company's progress. "We're doing good, Margaret," he'd say softly. "You were right. Kindness does come back around." It became a quiet ritual, one no one else knew about. He never sought comfort in recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing he was honoring her memory the way she had intended. Years later, when Jack finally decided to retire, the board begged him to stay. The company had become a global leader, and much of its success was credited to his leadership. But Jack knew it was time. He chose a successor from within the ranks, a young woman who had started as an apprentice mechanic in his division years earlier. Her story reminded him of his own, and he trusted her to protect the company's values. At his farewell ceremony, employees filled the room to celebrate him. They presented him with a framed photograph of Margaret standing beside him on the day the division launched, her arm resting proudly on his shoulder. Beneath it was engraved a single quote she once said to him: "Do good quietly. The world always notices." Jack smiled as he accepted it, his voice steady but low when he spoke. "I didn't get here by chasing success. I got here because someone believed in a small act of kindness. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: when life gives you the chance to do right, take it, even if no one's watching. You never know who that kindness belongs to." He left the company the same way he'd arrived, without fanfare, without speeches about legacy. Just a man walking away in the same boots, carrying the same wrench that started it all. On his drive home, he stopped at the side of the road where he'd once met Margaret years ago. The lot was long gone, replaced by a gas station and a small cafe. But standing there, he could almost hear the hum of that old car engine, the one that started everything. He smiled quietly, slipped the wrench into his pocket, and whispered, "Guess we both got fixed that day." Then he turned and walked toward the horizon, the sun dipping low behind him, the world humming with the simple truth he'd lived by: kindness costs nothing but changes everything. When he got home, he placed a letter on his table next to the old wrench he'd carried since his first day as a mechanic. It was a reminder of where he'd come from and how far he'd gone. And somewhere deep inside, he knew Margaret's son would have approved. He didn't argue, didn't beg, he just turned, took his wrench set, and walked out the door. The town felt different that morning, colder, somehow. He sat in his old pickup, staring at his calloused hands. All he'd done was help someone. That's all. He didn't know that miles away, the old lady was making a phone call that would change everything.